the number they tried to erase from history. Most numbers are harmless. They measure, they describe, they count. But some numbers do something else. They carry meaning, memory, fear, power. There are numbers that empires have tried to bury, not because they were incorrect, but because they were uncomfortable. Too symbolic, too revealing, too hard to explain away. This is not about conspiracy. It's about pattern. The pattern of fear that emerges when a number refuses to die. You see it scratched out of manuscripts, omitted from translations, renamed, redacted, forgotten on purpose. Because it was more than a value. It was a signal. A code pointing to something ancient, something the rational world couldn't contain or control. And what can't be controlled must be erased. The number may seem ordinary, but behind it was always a story, a myth, a silence. Perhaps it disrupted the neatness of theology. Perhaps it challenged the power of the state. Perhaps it whispered truths too old, too deep, too sacred. But whatever it was, they tried to remove it. Not by arguing against it, but by pretending it was never there. And yet, it always returns. Like a scar beneath new skin, like a rhythm that plays in the background even after the song ends. Because numbers, real numbers, aren't just math. They are symbols. And this one carried something that no empire could fully erase. Not all symbols are safe. Some don't sit quietly on the page. They whisper, they glow, they unsettle. A number, on its own, means nothing. But when enough people assign it meaning, when it becomes a vessel, it begins to move through culture like a shadow. And shadows, as Jung said, are everything we've repressed, everything we fear to look at, everything we hide in plain sight. That's what happened to this number. It stopped being a value. It became a mirror, and people don't like what they see when a mirror doesn't flatter them. This number became taboo, a symbol of heresy, a symbol of disorder, a symbol of power that wasn't sanctioned by priest or king. It was feared not because it harmed, but because it spoke. Spoke to something deep, pre-verbal, archetypal. It was connected to cycles, to death, to divine feminine, to unpredictable harmony, and the cultures that followed control couldn't allow that. So it was twisted, associated with evil, with failure, with madness, with bad luck. It was no longer a symbol of wisdom, but of threat. And once a symbol is made dangerous, its very presence becomes defiance. That's why it had to be removed, not because it was false, but because it opened a door the world was told to keep shut. But you know the truth. You've seen it in dreams, in clocks, in pages they forgot to edit. The symbol is still here, because symbols can't be killed. They can only be buried, and what is buried waits. You won't find it where it used to be. Look through the scrolls, the sutras, the stone carvings. It's missing. Cut out, smoothed over, replaced with silence or symmetry, not by accident, but with intention. Because once, this number sat in temples, inscribed on floors, etched into the geometry of the sacred. It showed up in the patterns of stars, the timing of rituals, the proportions of statues. But then, it vanished. In the early texts of religion and science, you see its fingerprints, in measurements, in distances, in harmonic ratios. Then suddenly nothing. Whole systems were restructured to avoid it. Architects abandoned it. Philosophers rephrased it. Monks skipped it when counting prayers. Even where it appears, it is coded. hidden inside other patterns, disguised in symmetry, buried under names that feel safe. Why? Because symbols carry memory, and this one carried the memory of a knowledge that preceded control, that danced before dogma, that bloomed before conquest. This number wasn't dangerous because it was wrong. It was dangerous because it pointed elsewhere, to older ways of knowing, to cycles over lines, to resonance over doctrine, to balance over authority. And so they made it disappear, not with fire, but with forgetting. Because forgetting is quieter. It doesn't create martyrs. It doesn't raise questions. It just closes the door, slowly, and hopes no one will remember how to open it. But some of us do, because that number still shows up in dreams, in architecture, in myths we can't quite place. It was never truly erased, just hidden in plain sight. You can hide a number from a book. You can remove it from a temple. You can burn the scroll, rewrite the formula, silence the name. But a pattern is harder to kill because patterns don't live in ink. They live in reality, in recurrence, in form. And this number, this forbidden number, wasn't just theory. It was a structure, a vibration, a rhythm the world couldn't stop echoing. It kept returning. In the spiral of galaxies, in the curve of waves, in the petals of flowers, and the bones of the human hand. In the music we call sacred, even when we don't know why. You'll find it in the proportions of temples long buried, in pyramids, in cathedrals, in the way light enters a space designed not for function, but for feeling. You'll find it in art, even when the artist swore it wasn't there, even when they never studied math, because the number was already in them, in all of us, like a memory. It lives in breath, in cycles, in sleep and return, in the rhythm of blood and the pause between thoughts. The number they tried to erase was never just a number. It was a reminder that truth can't be owned, that meaning can't be caged, that the universe hums in keys we weren't taught to hear. And once you hear it, you start noticing it everywhere. That's why they tried to hide it, not because it was forgotten, but because it refused to be. It kept pulsing, through music, through dreams, through architecture, through us. Not defiant, just present. Because you can bury a number, but you can't bury the pattern it came from. We are taught to think of numbers as tools, as inventions, ways to measure and manipulate the world, currency, calculation, code. But the ancients knew otherwise. To them, numbers weren't created, they were discovered. Not symbols for things, but things in themselves, living structures of truth. To Pythagoras, numbers were not mathematical, they were metaphysical. They were the architecture of reality, the secret order behind chaos, the harmony inside silence. He saw the world not as matter, but as music, and number was its rhythm, its pulse, its logic, its soul. This isn't mysticism, it's recognition. Walk into a cathedral built on sacred proportion, and you feel it even if you've never studied geometry. Look at a sunflower, a nautilus shell, a hurricane, a galaxy. They all spiral along the same path, a number hidden in form. Not assigned by humans, not forced by formula, just there, embedded in the design of everything. Because the universe doesn't speak in words, it speaks in patterns, and pattern is number in motion. The Egyptians built temples aligned with the stars. The Mayans mapped time through number. The Greeks gave numbers, personality, odd, and even, male and female. sacred and profane. They didn't reduce life to math. They lifted math into meaning. But over time, something changed. We stopped listening. We stopped seeing number as symbol and began treating it like code, functional, predictable, neutral. But not all numbers wanted to be neutral. Some carried meanings too large for language, too potent, too alive. The number they tried to erase was one of those, not because it failed in calculation, but because it succeeded in evocation. It called things up, it opened doors, it hinted at a structure beneath the structure, a logic older than logic. And the world, obsessed with certainty, couldn't bear a number that refused to be contained. Because once you realize that numbers don't just count, they speak, you begin to hear them everywhere. In the silence between notes, in the distance between stars, in the timing of breath, in the shape of memory. And you begin to understand. There are numbers you memorize in school, and there are numbers you remember in the soul. This number was one of those. It was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be felt. Like a chord you forgot you knew until it's played again, and suddenly something stirs. That's the number they tried to erase. Not because it was wrong, but because it was true. And truth, when it's that quiet, that persistent, that symbolic, cannot be owned, only recognized. You've seen it before. You just don't remember where. Not with your mind, but with something older. A recognition without origin. A familiarity without memory. That's how you know it's real. Somewhere, this number lives inside you, not like a password, but like a frequency, a resonance. It flickers in dreams. It repeats on clocks. It appears in books, buildings, dreams, receipts, addresses, and when it does, you pause. You feel something shift, something unspoken, something precise. You tell yourself it's coincidence, because you've been taught to say that, to file it away, to look away, but it keeps showing up. It returns, always, quietly, patiently. Why? Because it's not a number you were meant to study. It's a number you were meant to notice, not with logic, with intuition. There are numbers that pass through your life like weather, and then there are numbers that anchor it, like bones beneath skin, like rhythm beneath melody. This number is not mathematical, it is mythological. It doesn't just measure, it reminds. Of what? Of the sacred, of the strange, of something lost that was never truly gone. That's why it was feared. That's why it was erased. Because it did something dangerous. It broke the illusion of forgetfulness. The systems that shape the world depend on forgetting. Forgetting mystery, forgetting awe, forgetting the possibility that meaning can exist outside the official story. But this number doesn't care about stories. It moves through them, like a rhythm under a lie, like music behind the noise. And once you feel it, not just see it, but feel it, it becomes impossible to unsee. Because this number is not about what you know, it's about who you are beneath knowing. It's a signal from your own unconscious, from a version of yourself that still remembers how to read the patterns of the world. That's why it finds you when you're not looking. That's why it shows up in dreams, in shadows, in synchronicities. It's not looking for your belief. It's looking for your attention. Because the moment you look at it, truly look, it becomes what it always was. A door. Not to knowledge, but to memory. Not to information, but to integration. And the reason they tried to erase it is simple. They knew you'd eventually remember. We think forgetting is an accident, a lapse, something passive. But history tells a different story. Forgetting can be designed, engineered, structured like a ritual, not to erase memory completely, but to make remembering feel unnatural. Because what we are trained to forget is often exactly what was once too powerful to be remembered freely. That number, the one they tried to erase, wasn't erased because it was irrelevant. It was erased because it was remembered too deeply. It lived not in textbooks, but in temples, not on whiteboards, but in wombs, bones, and stars. It wasn't information, it was initiation, and the cultures that feared it knew exactly what it was capable of. Disrupting the story, breaking the loop, waking the sleeper. So instead of banning it outright, they buried it, quietly, repeatedly, under layers of coincidence and ridicule. And they replaced it with something easier, cleaner, linear, profitable. This is how forgetting works. It's not silence, it's distraction. You weren't told to fear the number. You were told it was irrelevant, that noticing it was just superstition, that feeling something when you saw it was meaningless. So you brushed it off, again and again, until the brushing became a habit, and the habit became a script. And now forgetting is embedded not in your intellect, but in your reflexes. You see the number, you feel something strange, and you laugh it off. But the number isn't laughing. It waits, beneath your language, beneath your posture, beneath the layer of mind that responds to training. Because it was never part of the system. It was the crack in it, the rhythm that didn't match the metronome. And forgetting it wasn't an accident. It was a ritual of control, passed down through stories, calendars, and silence. But here's the paradox. What is ritualized can be reversed. You don't need to believe in the number. You need to remember it. To notice how it moves, where it hides, what it touches. You need to sit with it like a symbol, not like a problem. And then you'll see what they were afraid you'd find. That this number was not erased, it was veiled. That forgetting was the ritual, but recognition is the awakening. And the veil? It was never locked. You just had to know there was something behind it. You can bury a truth, but you cannot kill its rhythm. You can silence a symbol, but you cannot erase its pattern. You can call something coincidence 1,000 times, but if it keeps returning, it isn't coincidence anymore. The number they tried to erase never left. It adapted. It changed clothes. It learned how to move quietly through minds, through architecture, through time. It appears in the proportions of ancient temples and modern tech, in the curve of a cathedral arch and the algorithm of a timeline. It echoes in the spirals of nature and the frequencies of sound. It pulses in sacred geometry and reemerges in the unlikeliest places: graffiti, dream journals, art, ruins, code. Because what's real doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to persist. This number persists. Despite all efforts, despite forgetting, despite erasure, it shows up in the margins, in the anomalies, in the things that don't quite make sense until you step back and let the pattern reveal itself. It shows up when you're not trying, when your guard is down, when your logic has gone to sleep, and then there it is. On a clock, in a book, on a receipt, in a song, in the fold of a shadow, in the background of a dream. You feel it more than you understand it. And that's the key. Because this number was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be felt, recognized, like a returning sound in a dark room that reminds you of something you never learned but always knew. That's why they tried to erase it. Because it doesn't obey. It doesn't align. It doesn't stay within systems. It dismantles them quietly. from within. It teaches without speaking. It questions without words. And it remembers you when you forget yourself. So the truth is this: they didn't fail to erase the number, because they never could. It was never only on paper. It was in the structure of life, of breath, of consciousness. You don't have to believe in it. You just have to see it. And once you do, you'll never unsee it again. Because what remains cannot be hidden.